In the freezing, wind-whipped nights of January 1942, a surreal and terrifying disjunction existed between the geopolitical reality of the world and the glittering coastline of the United States, a psychological gap that was about to be filled with burning oil and screaming men. While the Pacific Fleet lay in smoking ruin at Pearl Harbor and the armies of the Third Reich were freezing at the gates of Moscow, the Eastern Seaboard of America remained defiantly, suicidally ablaze with the artificial light of a peace that no longer existed, unaware that the Atlantic Ocean had ceased to be a protective moat and had transformed into a highway for the greatest underwater predators in naval history. Under the command of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the Befehlshaber der U-Boote, a wolf pack of 5 long-range Type 9 U-boats had been dispatched from the hardened submarine pens of Lorient, France, with orders to execute Operation Paukenschlag, or Drumbeat, a strategic offensive designed to strike at the soft underbelly of the American supply chain before the sleeping giant could fully wake. Leading this vanguard was Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hardigan, the audacious commander of U-123, who steered his vessel through the winter storms of the North Atlantic with a mix of professional grimness and predatory anticipation. As U-123 approached the coastal waters of Long Island and New York on the night of January 14, Hardigan raised his periscope, expecting to find a darkened, terrified continent bracing for war, but what he saw through the optics made him gasp in disbelief and then smile with the cold satisfaction of a hunter who has stumbled upon a sleeping prey. The horizon was not black, it was a glowing dome of luminescence that rivaled the dawn. The United States, in an act of staggering hubris and commercial stubbornness, had refused to implement a coastal blackout. The lights of Broadway, the neon signs of Times Square, the car headlights streaming along the coastal highways, and the blazing beacons of the lighthouses at Montauk Point and Ambrose were all functioning as if the world were at peace, casting a radiance that stretched 20 miles out to sea. To the German submariners, who had spent years fighting in the pitch-black freezing hell of the North Sea, where a single lit cigarette could invite a depth charge attack from the Royal Navy, this display was incomprehensible, a shooting gallery provided courtesy of the American Tourist Board. The tactical implication of this illumination was catastrophic for the merchant ships plying the coastal lanes. The bright backdrop of the cities meant that any ship passing between the U-boat and the shore was perfectly silhouetted as a sharp black cutout against the glowing horizon, allowing the German gunners to calculate speed, range, and identity with mathematical precision without ever using their active sonar or revealing their position. Hardigan noted in his war diary that it seemed as if the Americans were inviting him to a carnival rather than a war, describing the scene as illuminated like a dance floor. The waters were crowded with fat, defenseless targets, tankers carrying crude oil from the Gulf of Mexico, freighters laden with bauxite and steel, steaming with their navigation lights on, maintaining regular radio schedules, and adhering to peacetime shipping lanes that the Germans had already mapped. The U-boat crews, who had nicknamed this deployment the Second Happy Time in anticipation of the slaughter, found that the reality exceeded their wildest dreams. On the night of January 14, U-123 stalked the Panamanian-flagged tanker Norness, a massive vessel carrying thousands of tons of fuel, moving sluggishly south of Long Island. The attack was not a battle, it was an execution. Hardigan maneuvered his boat on the surface, confident that no American destroyers were patrolling the area and that no aircraft would spot him in the dark water against the blinding shore. He fired his torpedoes from close range. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. The Norness shuddered as the warheads detonated, ripping open her hull and igniting her volatile cargo. A pillar of fire erupted into the night sky, visible from the boardwalks of the Hamptons where civilians were likely finishing their dinners. As the tanker began to list and sink, spilling its black blood into the freezing Atlantic, the crew of U-123 watched the spectacle with a mixture of awe and contempt for an enemy that would sacrifice its sailors for the convenience of neon lights. The distress signals from the Norness were picked up by shore stations, But the reaction was one of confusion and paralysis. The U.S. Navy, under the command of the Anglophobic and stubborn Admiral Ernest King, had refused to adopt the British convoy system, leaving these merchant ships to sail alone and unprotected. The sinking of the Nornis was just the opening note of the drumbeat. In the coming days, Hardigan and his fellow commanders would roam the coast from New York to Cape Hatteras, sinking ship after ship with impunity, often surfacing to use their deck guns to save expensive torpedoes, shelling freighters within sight of the Ferris wheels and hotels of the resort towns. The American public, who had believed the war was a distant abstraction to be fought in the jungles of Asia or the fields of Europe, woke up to the horrific reality that the front line was now the high tide mark of their own beaches. They stood on the dunes, wrapped in winter coats, watching the smoke of burning ships smudge the horizon, stunned by the realization that the enemy was not coming, he was already here, hiding in the shadows of their own electric vanity, turning the Atlantic seaboard into a graveyard illuminated by the very lights they refused to turn off.
As the calendar turned to February and March of 1942, the center of gravity for Operation Drumbeat shifted south from the frozen approaches of New York Harbor to the treacherous, storm-tossed waters off the coast of North Carolina, a specific geographic choke point known as Cape Hatteras, which the terrified merchant mariners soon christened with a darker name, Torpedo Junction. Here, the continental shelf narrowed, and the shipping lanes were forced to hug the jagged coastline to avoid the strong opposing current of the Gulf Stream, creating a natural funnel that concentrated hundreds of tankers and freighters into a predictable, densely packed stream of traffic that was virtually undefended. For the German U-boat commanders, who had now been joined by a second wave of Type 9 submarines, this area became the killing floor of the Second Happy Time, a period of such asymmetrical slaughter that it felt less like warfare and more like an industrial harvest. The tactical environment at Hatteras was even more favorable to the Germans than New York had been. The shallow waters allowed the U-boats to sit on the sandy bottom during the day to conserve battery power and rest the crews, waiting for the cover of darkness to surface and wreak havoc. The tragedy of the slaughter was compounded by the stubborn refusal of the American merchant captains to extinguish their navigation lights. Terrified of colliding with one another in the crowded shipping lanes and lacking the discipline of naval convoys, these civilian masters kept their running lights blazing, arguing that the risk of a collision was statistically higher than the risk of a submarine attack, a fatal miscalculation that the Germans exploited with ruthless efficiency. When night fell, the U-boats would surface, their low profiles rendering them invisible against the dark water, while the American ships, lit up like floating carnivals or silhouetted against the glow of the coastal towns that still refused to dim their streetlights, stood out as perfect black cutouts against the horizon. The German tactic shifted from the stealthy underwater torpedo attack to the brazen brutality of surface gunnery. Aiming to conserve their precious torpedoes for the largest tankers, the U-boat commanders unleashed their 105mm deck guns, turning the engagement into a barbaric, close-range execution. A typical attack would begin with a single torpedo shot to cripple the target's engines, bringing the massive freighter to a drifting halt, after which the U-boat would surface within a few hundred yards, its searchlight blinding the panicked crew on the merchant ship's deck. Then, the shelling would begin. The 105mm shells smashed into the bridge and the crew quarters, turning the ship's superstructure into a twisted wreck of steel and fire, while the 20 and 37mm anti-aircraft flak guns of the submarine were used to sweep the decks, cutting down sailors as they desperately tried to lower lifeboats. The horror of these nights was visceral and apocalyptic. The burning tankers filled with crude oil or high-octane aviation fuel did not just sink, they exploded, turning the ocean surface into a terrifying mosaic of burning lakes. Survivors who managed to jump clear of the wreck often found themselves swimming in a viscous sludge of bunker oil that clogged their eyes, ears, and lungs, only to realize with dawning horror that the oil itself was catching fire. The screams of men burning to death in the water could be heard by the German crews on the conning towers, a sound that hardened some hearts and haunted others, but the mission required total destruction. The proximity of the violence to the American shore added a surreal layer to the nightmare. The battles were often fought so close to land that the vibrations of the explosions rattled the windows of beachfront cottages in Nag's Head and Kitty Hawk. On the German side, the morale was euphoric. They were operating thousands of miles from home, yet they were sinking tonnage faster than the British and Americans could build it, suffering almost no losses in return because the U.S. Navy's presence was practically non-existent. The destroyers that should have been protecting these waters either were committed to the Atlantic crossings to Britain or held in reserve for fleet actions that never materialized, leaving the defense of the coast to a ragtag collection of converted yachts and unarmed Coast Guard cutters that the Germans derisively called the Hooligan Navy. As the weeks dragged on, the waters off Cape Hatteras became choked with debris. The ocean floor was littered with the rusting hulks of dozens of ships, creating a new artificial reef made of iron and bones. The slaughter in the silhouettes was absolute. It was a massacre of the defenseless by the invisible, allowed to happen by a naval command that was paralyzed by indecision, and a civilian populace that had not yet learned that in modern war, light is synonymous with death. The sea turned black with oil and red with blood, washing the evidence of the catastrophe onto the pristine sands of the Outer Banks, forcing a nation that had tried to ignore the war to finally look it in the eye as the bodies of its own sailors began to drift ashore with the morning tide.
By the spring of 1942, the war had ceased to be a distant abstraction confined to the newsreels playing in darkened theaters or the static-filled reports of the radio. It had become a physical, tactile reality that washed up on the pristine sands of the American East Coast with the relentless rhythm of the tide. The Atlantic Ocean, once viewed as an impregnable moat protecting the New World from the madness of the Old, had been transformed into a conveyor belt of horror, delivering the wreckage of the Battle of the Atlantic directly to the feet of vacationers and retirees. Nowhere was this surreal collision between domestic tranquility and industrial slaughter more jarring than in Florida, the Sunshine State, where the tourism industry was still booming despite the global conflict. In the grand hotels of Palm Beach and Jacksonville, wealthy guests sat on verandas sipping cocktails, expecting to watch the sunset over the water, but instead found themselves serving as the audience for a macabre maritime theater. It was not uncommon for the dinner conversation to be interrupted by a sudden blinding flash on the horizon, followed seconds later by the dull, thudding crump of a torpedo detonation that rattled the silverware on the tables. The guests would rush to the railings, watching in horrified fascination as a pillar of oily black smoke climbed into the twilight sky, marking the grave of yet another tanker. The war was so close that in some instances, the flames from the burning ships were bright enough to read a newspaper by on the beach, a terrifying lighthouse of destruction that mocked the serenity of the palm trees. But it was the mornings that brought the true grimness of the situation home to the civilian population. As the sun rose over beaches that had previously known only footprints and seashells, early risers began to stumble upon the flotsam of the massacre. The white sands of Virginia Beach, the Outer Banks, and the Florida Gold Coast were frequently coated in a thick, viscous sludge of bunker oil, a black tide that ruined the beaches and coated the feathers of dying seabirds. But mixed in with the tar and the driftwood were objects that stopped the breath in the throat, splintered wooden crates stamped with manifest numbers, life jackets with the names of sunken ships stenciled on the back, empty lifeboats drifting aimlessly in the surf, and most horrifying of all, the bodies. The corpses of merchant mariners, burned beyond recognition or bloated by the sea, began to drift ashore with disturbing regularity, their frozen limbs tangled in the seaweed. Local coroners and Coast Guardsmen were overwhelmed by the task of retrieving and identifying these men, often finding that they carried no identification other than the tattoos on their arms or the letters from home in their sodden pockets. The sight of a dead sailor washing up in front of a luxury resort was a psychological shock that shattered the American sense of invulnerability. It forced the average citizen to confront the fact that the enemy was not over there. He was right here, hiding just beneath the waves, killing Americans within sight of their own homes. This proximity to violence bred a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia and hysteria that swept through the coastal communities like a fever. The rumor mill went into overdrive. Civilians, terrifyingly aware of their own helplessness, began to see German spies behind every curtain and in every shadow. Reports flooded into local FBI and police offices of mysterious lights signaling from the shore, flashlights blinking code from lonely dunes, car headlights flashing in rhythmic patterns on coastal roads, or curtains being opened and closed in suspicious sequences in high-rise apartments. While most of these were coincidences or the result of overactive imaginations, the fear was real. The belief took root that the U-boats were being guided to their targets by a network of saboteurs operating on American soil, a fifth column that was betraying the merchant sailors. This paranoia led to a darkened mood in the coastal towns. Neighbors looked at neighbors with suspicion, and the carefree atmosphere of the boardwalks evaporated, replaced by a grim vigilance. The loose lips sink ships campaign took on a literal, deadly meaning. The anger of the public was directed not just at the invisible Germans, but at their own government. "Where is the Navy?" became the common refrain in barbershops and town hall meetings. People watched the carnage unfold night after night and looked in vain for the destroyers and airplanes that were supposed to be protecting them. They saw only the unarmed Civil Air Patrol planes, private pilots in Piper Cubs trying to spot submarines, and the undermanned Coast Guard cutters that were woefully outgunned by the German U-boats. The feeling of abandonment was palpable. Mayors of coastal cities demanded answers from Washington, asking why their sons were dying in oil-slicked waters just a mile from the pier, while the Atlantic Fleet seemed to be missing in action. The reality that Admiral King was hoarding his destroyers for transatlantic convoys and refusing to coastal defense was a strategic decision that the grieving families could not understand or forgive. The war had arrived on the doorstep, bringing with it the smell of burning fuel and the sight of death, and for the first time in nearly a century, the American people felt the cold, terrifying grip of a siege mentality, realizing that the ocean was no longer a shield, but a door that had been kicked wide open. While the beaches of the East Coast were being turned into oil-soaked graveyards and the morale of the American public began to fracture under the strain of the visible slaughter, the true architect of the disaster sat not in a U-boat conning tower, but in a Spartan, austere office in the Navy Department building in Washington, D.C. Admiral Ernest J. King, the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, Comanche, was a man of immense intellect, iron will, and a legendary abrasiveness that led him to reportedly remark that when the going gets tough, they send for the sons of bitches. However, in the critical early months of 1942, King's greatest strength, his unyielding stubbornness, became the fatal flaw that nearly lost the Battle of the Atlantic before it had truly begun. The catastrophe of Operation Drumbeat was not a result of a lack of resources, but a failure of doctrine, rooted in King's deep-seated professional arrogance and a well-documented Anglophobia that clouded his strategic judgment. Since 1939, the British Royal Navy had been fighting the U-boat menace and had learned, through the painful loss of millions of tons of shipping, that the only effective defense against submarines was the convoy system. The British Admiralty sent a delegation to Washington, pleading with King to immediately organize coastal shipping into defended columns, arguing that where the sheep are, the wolves will go, and that by placing even a single armed escort near the merchant ships, the U-boats would be forced to attack under unfavorable conditions. King, however, dismissed the British advice with contempt, viewing the Royal Navy as a defensive-minded declining force and insisting that the United States Navy would not adopt a passive strategy. He held on to the disastrously incorrect belief that inadequately escorted convoys are worse than none, a theory that assumed a convoy without a ring of destroyers was just a larger target, whereas statistical reality proved that even a single armed trawler could deter a U-boat. Instead of protecting the ships, King ordered his destroyers to form hunter-killer groups, roaming the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean in search of U-boats, a strategy akin to searching for a needle in a haystack while the needle is busy burning down the barn. This offensive mindset left the merchant ships completely naked. The few destroyers available were sent on wild goose chases patrolling empty squares of ocean, while miles away, the U-boats were leisurely picking off tankers one by one. The disparity was maddening to the British liaisons and the terrified merchant captains. They watched as the U.S. Navy wasted fuel and time hunting ghosts, while the real enemy was sitting off the coast of New Jersey, feasting on the undefended traffic. Furthermore, King's refusal to demand a mandatory coastal blackout was a dereliction of duty born of bureaucratic friction and a reluctance to interfere with civilian commerce. He argued that the Navy did not have the authority to order cities to turn off their lights, passing the buck to civil defense authorities who were more concerned with tourism revenue than national survival. This business-as-usual attitude meant that while American boys were dying in the infernos of torpedoed tankers, the boardwalks remained lit so that vacationers could buy saltwater taffy. The German U-boat commanders were baffled by this strategic incompetence. They could not understand why the Americans, who possessed the greatest industrial capacity on Earth, were fighting with such amateurish tactics. They wrote home that the American defenses were childish and that the lack of convoys made their job embarrassingly easy. The cost of King's obstinacy was measured in a staggering loss of tonnage and life. In March 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 500,000 tons of Allied shipping, much of it in American waters. The oil hemorrhage was so severe that by the summer, the United States, the world's largest oil producer, was facing a fuel shortage on the East Coast simply because the tankers could not survive the trip from the Gulf of Mexico. It wasn't until the pressure from the White House and the undeniable mathematics of the slaughter became overwhelming that King finally, grudgingly, began to relent. He had to be forced by the sheer weight of failure to accept that his offensive strategy was a fantasy and that the defensive convoy system was the only way to save the war effort. It was a tragic irony that the man chosen to save the Navy was for the first 6 months of the war the U-boat's greatest ally, proving that in the high-stakes game of naval warfare, the most dangerous thing on the ocean is not a torpedo, but a closed mind at the top of the chain of command. The admiral's arrogance had built a highway of sunken ships from Maine to Florida, a grim monument to the fact that lessons in war are rarely learned until the tuition is paid in blood. By the late spring of 1942, the second happy time for the German U-boat crews began to curdle into a grim season of frustration and danger as the United States Navy, finally bowing to the undeniable mathematics of attrition and the deafening public outcry, began to implement the one strategy that Admiral King had stubbornly resisted: the convoy system. The turning point came not with a single decisive battle, but with a bureaucratic capitulation and the establishment of the Bucket Brigade, a rudimentary but effective system of interlocking convoys that shepherded merchant ships along the coast in protected hops from port to port, moving from daylight anchorage to daylight anchorage under the watchful eyes of whatever motley collection of escorts could be scraped together. Simultaneously, and perhaps more psychologically impactful, the great American dim-out was finally enforced with the rigor of martial law. The neon signs of Broadway were unplugged, the headlights of cars on coastal highways were painted half black or extinguished, and the blackout curtains in the grand hotels of Florida were drawn tight, plunging the Eastern Seaboard into a profound defensive darkness that erased the deadly silhouettes that had served the U-boats so well. When the veteran German commanders returned to their hunting grounds in May and June, peering through their periscopes off the coast of New Jersey or Cape Hatteras, they were met with a shocking and hostile void. The shooting gallery had closed. The horizon was no longer a glowing ribbon of light, but a wall of black ink, and the sea, once teeming with solitary, careless merchant ships, now appeared empty. The targets had huddled together into tight, disciplined formations, surrounded by the churning wakes of destroyers and Coast Guard cutters that were now equipped with improved radar and sonar, actively pinging the depths with a predatory rhythm. The hunters had become the hunted. The psychological shift in the U-boat pens in France was palpable. Crews who had previously fought to be assigned to the American theater now looked at the charts with trepidation, knowing that the easy kills were gone and that the Americans had finally learned the art of anti-submarine warfare. The U.S. Navy, desperate to bridge the gap while waiting for more destroyers to be built, improvised with a ruthless ingenuity, deploying Q ships, heavily armed merchant vessels disguised as helpless freighters, to lure U-boats to the surface, and unleashing the Civil Air Patrol, a ragtag volunteer army of private pilots flying their own yellow Piper Cubs and Stinsons armed with depth charges, buzzing over the waves like angry hornets to force the submarines to dive. These civilian aviators, though often unarmed, proved to be a decisive psychological weapon, forcing the U-boats to spend precious daylight hours submerged, draining their batteries and blinding their reconnaissance. The happy time ended not with a bang, but with a strategic withdrawal. Grand Admiral Dennitz, realizing that the cost of operating off the American coast now outweighed the benefits, ordered his wolf packs to redeploy to the Caribbean and the Mid-Atlantic Gap, acknowledging that the window of opportunity had slammed shut. In July 1942, the U-215 was sunk by a British trawler and aircraft off the coast of New England, and the U-85 had already been sent to the bottom near Hatteras, signaling that the waters were no longer safe for the predators. The withdrawal of the U-boats marked the end of Operation Drumbeat, a campaign that had been a dazzling tactical success for Germany, but a strategic wake-up call for the United States. The cost of the lesson had been exorbitant. In 6 months, the U-boats had sunk nearly 400 Allied ships and killed over 5,000 seamen, a tonnage loss that threatened to strangle the Allied war effort before it could even cross the ocean. The ocean floor from Maine to Florida was paved with the rusting bones of tankers and freighters, a hidden underwater monument to the hubris of the early war months. Yet the defeat of the U-boat offensive on the East Coast was also the moment the United States truly entered the naval war. The amateur period was over. The lights were out, the convoys were running, and the grim, relentless machinery of victory had finally engaged its gears. As the last U-boat turned its bow towards France, leaving behind a darkened and vigilant America, the ocean remained silent, hiding its dead, but the shipping lanes remained open, pumping the lifeblood of oil and steel that would eventually fuel the liberation of Europe, proving that while the Americans could be caught sleeping, they woke up with a terrible resolve that no torpedo could sink.